Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. I'm Matt Schultz with the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. When thinking about problems of global scale, such as phosphorus sustainability, it helps to have global data sets to inform your ideas. It can be a real act of love assembling such data sets, which can involve millions of data points and tedious exercises in harmonizing them, making sure units match and collection methods are comparable, etc. My guest today is Dr. Rich McDowell, who is a professor at Lincoln University in New Zealand. He's provided a great service to our community by publishing and making freely available a massive curated data set of nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations across some 1,400 catchments around the globe. That includes modeled nutrient yields across over 6,000 catchments. I talked to him to find out more about the data set and how he developed it and how he sees the data being used. Well, thanks, Rich, for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. It's great to have you here. It's a great paper. I'm interested in hearing about it.
Okay, thanks, Matt, and welcome to tomorrow. So I'll just take a few minutes to go over the paper. It's a very, shall I say, simple paper. It's just a data descriptor, but it did take an awful lot of effort for a very small team. And you'll see in front of you, you'll see the front page of it, is both the DOI of the paper itself and also the data set where you can get access to this data, all the data that was used to both create the loads and yields, and I guess the discharge and concentration data is there for you also. Just to acknowledge a few folks, there are so many of them. I've just selected a few from around the globe, and also a little bit of funding that helped me do this in my lunchtime, shall we say. So, why put together a global data set, I guess, of both concentration, discharge, and then also of loads and yields? Well, there isn't one, believe it or not, or at least one that has sufficient coverage in order to inform both, I guess, lumped and distributed models that are commonly used for scenarios. And by that, I'm meaning statistical models that use empirical data, and those that are more process-based or distributed. And we've used these models in the past for many, many facets, looking at global nutrient efficiency, nutrient use efficiency, especially relevant in the face of having finite resources. It also tells us where in not only the globe, but also either continental jurisdictions and large catchments, we have both hotspots of loss to fresh water and also to the oceans. And also it can tell us a bit about the role of both point and diffuse sources in a circular economy. The data itself, obviously it came from multiple sources. I've put a few here. The United Nations, obviously the Glorich data set, if you haven't cotton onto that one, it's an amazing resource. We've got being a little bit parochial here, but also on the basis that I knew these data were reasonably good quality from Australasia, so I've pilfered those. And of course, the Global Runoff Data Center based out of Germany. Those are just some of the data sets that we've collected. We've also utilized some land use data in the form of both ecoregions, biomes, there's the USGS, ecophysiographic stratification, and there are a number of climate and hydrological databases that came from NASA and land use data that came from MODIS, for example. And we've had to generate some of our own data as well in order to predict or distribute some of the loads across the globe. And part of that has involved creating a global map of soil phosphorus. This is a preliminary map that we've used in this one. We've developed a much more rigorous one now and are in the process of working that up into, again, something that people can use.
So that'll be a separate paper, Rich, that you're planning
It will
on?
be,
Great.
yeah. yeah, that's taken over 2 years to collect that data and
Looking forward to
process it. Yeah.
that.
So likewise, that one has taken a similar sort of filtering and processing regimen. I'll just give an example here in terms of step by step, just talking you through it. It's not only acquiring it, but there's a lot of effort, and I'm sure people will be aware of this in terms of checking it. Not only do you have severe outliers, which may be due to a transcribing error, or there could just be text instead of numerical data that comes through. So you've got to kind of check that. You've got to georeference it. Often a point may be out of sync, shall we say, spatially with where it's supposed to be. And it's also the case that if it's not aligned to a catchment boundary, you could be getting a load for a completely different catchment. So each one of those has to be checked as well. There's a further filtering, and importantly, we've harmonized this data. We've harmonized it to a common date stamp between 2005 and 2012. There were data that going back to probably about the 1910s and all the way through to the present day, but we wanted to get a window of data that encompassed, I guess, better representation, global representation, but also good consistency and quality. So we chose that 7-year window. We chose a 7-year window as well because there are a lot of climatic influences, such as, for example, the Southern Oscillation Index, which means that you can have wet years and dry years, even in temperate climates. So going beyond that, we checked each site to ensure that there was sufficient data to come up with a load calculation, enough observations, at least for 3 years. And where there were censored data, i.e. non-detects, which only accounted for less than 2% of the data set, they were set to half the limit of detection. We were going to do, in fact, we have done subsequently some imputation techniques to kind of smooth that out, but that wasn't in this particular data set. And likewise, we've improved on the load and yield estimates that have been calculated from this paper, but we've stuck with the tried and true here, which is a 7-parameter USGS model that takes into account seasonality, flow regimes, etc. Beyond that, those calculations, we've then validated, gone through an exercise of validating the outputs using data from Australasia, both nitrogen and phosphorus. We chose that data because it's both of high quality, also encompasses a wide array of biomes from tropical all the way through to very arid. So that was an important step for us to see the performance of our models. Data set itself covers 1,421 catchments, 48% of the global landmass. You can see there, that's stuff in blue effectively. And the stuff in green was those catchments that we used to assess the performance of our models. The performance of those can be represented in a number of ways. I've just got a very general one here, just the coefficient determination. I haven't given any dashed up cliffs or anything like that, but you might be looking at that and thinking, well, that's pretty low, isn't it? Well, believe it or not, that's either similar like or much better than many of the best performing global models itself. And it gives us, we had, I guess, some confidence in the outputs because when we went to do the validation, we were getting numbers that were either of a similar magnitude, albeit they might be lifted up a little bit, but also similar slope. And so that's what these 4 plots here represent. Those are the estimated, I guess, global yield models.
Yeah, and Rich, if I can interrupt, you noted in the paper that for some reason the nitrogen estimates were closer than the phosphorus ones. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why that is.
Yeah, well, I know many of the audience would agree, nitrogen tends to be much simpler and easier to model, especially with regards to flow regimes. And I think it's highly sensitive to extremes, extremes not only in arid but also in extremely wet climates, where neither tend to be monitored that either well or that often. So I suspect that's probably one of the major factors involved in there as well. We suspect there could be a point source signal in some well-developed countries, although we did try and avoid sites that were within around 50 or 100 kilometers of a large metropolitan area. We couldn't discount that though.
Great, thanks.
So I've just drawn the output here in terms of, there's a particular data set called HydroSeds, which has obviously representations of catchment and watershed boundaries, and I've just taken a very coarse level. You can tell it's coarse because you've got entire countries encompassed by many of these catchment boundaries. But it's just to make the point here that in terms of a sensibility check, it kind of matches what you think, both in terms of what we may call legacy inputs and enrichment in certain areas such as Europe and North America, and a little bit of South America as well, but also naturally derived inputs such as what I'd call glacial flow or erosion that comes out of the Indian subcontinent, for example. So, what are the applications that you could use this potential data for? There are no constraints to the use of the data. Obviously, would like an acknowledgement that you're using it, and I'm sure the people who supplied the data to us would like that as well. But you can use this data for infilling, I guess, gaps in developing regions where there is a paucity of data. Importantly, that can also inform either existing or developing models to test, I guess, alternative scenarios, either around relative NRP losses and efficiency at a range of scales, or you can look at issues such as resource use and equity. I'm aware that there are also there's a lot of work, I guess, not only in terms of the efficiency, but also the impact of both NMP on aquatic systems. And so you could use this data to inform for potential management decisions associated with NRP use in either fresh water systems or indeed the consequences as it goes through into marine systems. And that could be under different flow regimes or indeed flood events if you take a change in climate into account. So there are some caveats around the data. It is biased, and I guess the chief one amongst those, that it is biased towards larger catchments. So if you look at a straight stream order, then it is of an order of maybe 6 or 7, which means that its fit to smaller streams or indeed headwater streams is probably questionable. But for a global data set, it's a reasonable amalgamation of what's available. Now, I just want to give you, I guess, one example of how it could be used. And I've mentioned the impact on fresh water. This is a piece of work that we've been done. Again, this is all open source. You can get the data, although it's a subset of the one that I'm just presenting to you today. It's a subset on the basis that we only use the concentration, I guess a bit of flow data at the time of sampling to flow weight some of the outputs. But it looked at the likelihood of periphyton or algal growth across the globe. And to do that, we've used thresholds. So those are thresholds in, say, total nitrogen or total phosphorus, or indeed nitrate or DRP. That mean that when someone looks at a stream, they they tend to think that when it gets beyond 30%, well, that's looking pretty cruddy. So 30% translates to a threshold, and believe it or not, there's not that much variation. I've put the extremes of variation in this table, but it kind of works out to be you could use an average threshold here of around 800 or 46 parts per billion for total N and total P respectively. So it's that, so it's the magnitude. It's also the ratio. So which means you could have an excess of phosphorus, but there's no growth because it's nitrogen limited. Or you could have an excess of nitrogen, but there's no growth because it's phosphorus limited. So you could have four scenarios here. One where it's N limited, but there's no growth. N limited, there is growth. Phosphorus limited, there's no growth. And phosphorus limited, and there is growth because it's above that threshold. So when you look at that, again, you can come up with a map which tells you where in the world there is likelihood of periphyton growth associated with either nitrogen or phosphorus limitation, and whether that growth exceeds a threshold. And the concentration, as opposed to the load and yield models, concentration models, gives a much better fit because it's less influenced by discharge. But the take-home messages for these outputs are that you've got, phosphorus crowd, that's much more prevalent to have nitrogen limitation, but you'll be encouraged by the fact that where you do have phosphorus limitation and where there is excessive growth, many more people, in fact 1.7 billion as opposed to 280 million, are affected by it. So it's quite important, I guess, that we get this under control and that we develop both more efficient systems, either through a circular economy, or that we put more mitigation strategies in place to help us, I guess, improve the situation, decrease the quantity of P going in, and hence the growth of periphyton. So that's just an application for you, Matt. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Questions. Yeah, thanks, Rich. It's great. You mentioned both during this talk and also in your paper that you've filtered out sites that were, I think it was up to 50 kilometers downstream of an urban center. And, of course, cities have a big impact on nutrient pollution. So can you explain what the thinking was there?
Absolutely. So we know that with wastewater treatment plants, there's a constant influx of P and other contaminants that come into the system. And we didn't want the yield models to be that influenced by it because it would skew the data, and you wouldn't be able to detect, I guess, determine what processes were influencing diffuse losses. And so that's why we tried to, isolate those. However, you can get access to those within the data set. You can either look at it via, we can overlap the spatial information that's in there, or indeed, if you're wanting, you can just request that from us, and we can probably supply that.
Yeah, when you say that, you're talking about the point source data, correct?
That's right, point source data.
Great, great. Yeah, great. Well, this is a fantastic contribution. Of course, you always want more, right? And I'm wondering about updates. So the data here were, I think, about 10 years old, which is totally understandable. But obviously, it'd be nice if we could do this kind of census on a rolling, frequent basis. Is there any hope of such a program? I mean, in light of the scale of measurements that you've collected and the difficulties, especially with sensing phosphorus in the environment?
Well, I mean, I'm struggling from memory here because it's so long since we did this, but I think there is historic data, so you can go back on many of the sites to outside of the, harmonized period that we used for the calculation of those loads. And there's also more up-to-date data, so some of it will be up to 2018. So you could, if you wished, you could reproduce the loads using a more up-to-date date stamp. The R code is all there for people to use that and do it yourself. So if you want to do that, you can do it with the data set that we've got. In terms of us updating it, obviously, yeah, we would like to do that. I'm thinking, you've got to have a sufficient period of time for it to make it worthwhile. So that might be in another 2 or 3 years' time.
Great. Okay. But it is something you're thinking about doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, Rich, thanks so much. This is a great contribution to the community, and I really appreciate the work that you and your team did on this. And thanks also for joining us today.
Just to reiterate again there, Matt, it is open source. You can get at it at the address I gave in the first slide and just go ahead and use it.
Great. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Matt.